Good afternoon, Remax Associate Agents. Hey, Rob Oakey here with this week's Broker Minute. Hey, I just wanted to talk about the unrepresented buyer disclosure and how important it is to make sure that it's being utilized in the transactions. Specifically, when we represent the seller on a transaction, and a buyer comes in, doesn't want any representation. We want to make sure that they get that we have that document signed. There's a couple of key things that are there. As a licensed agent, we have a responsibility to one of our administrative rules is to address agency prior to any written agreement. So yes, when we represent a seller, we need to have a listing agreement before we enter into any type of a purchase agreement. When we represent a buyer, we have to have a buyer broker agreement signed before we enter into a purchase agreement. Well, the same thing would apply even with an unrepresented buyer. So in section 5 of the REPSI, it is a confirmation that prior agency has been discussed. So too many times I'm seeing that we're having an agent that represents the seller. They put who they represent, which the company is there, and then they either say none under the buyer or NA, versus what you should put is unrepresented and then have them sign the unrepresented buyer disclosure. Why this is important is because too many times that unrepresented party, when something goes wrong, they try to find fault on the listing agent for not protecting the buyer, or they look for excuses that fall under the buyer's purview. So, for example, let's say that a deadline is passed, or something, a date is missed, and now the buyer falls into the category where their earnest money becomes at risk, and for whatever reason the buyer chooses to cancel and they don't get their earnest money refunded. Well, too many times the buyer comes, or this unrepresented buyer is saying that the listing agent misrepresented something, or they misquoted something. They didn't inform the buyer of something. Well, as the listing agent, you have a fiduciary duty of loyalty, confidentiality, full disclosure, obedience, everything to the seller. You do not have that to the buyer. And that's why it's important to have that unrepresented buyer disclosure as a second form of verification that the buyer understands, hey, they represent themselves. We do not represent them. Otherwise, all we have is some blank in the REPSI that doesn't add that extra layer of protection for you as a listing agent. So again, this is just a recap to make sure that when you are dealing with a party that is choosing to represent themselves, whether that be a for sale by owner, so you have a for sale by owner agreement, or the unrepresented buyer disclosure. So that's a buyer who's going to represent themselves as you represent the seller. Either way, we need to make sure that those forms are being filled out and utilized so that we have that additional documentation. If there's any questions you have about this, please feel to reach out to me, and happy to answer any way I can. Otherwise, hopefully you're having a great day and an even better week. All right, talk to you later.